whether or not individuals find themselves at the table in those rooms for those consultations or decide to protest in other ways and not participate, the message is the same. This practice needs to go. How we decide to go about seeing the elimination of the practices is the only difference. And so I wanted to be clear on that. Our message is that this practice absolutely has to go. And if we're talking about regulations, we're talking about regulating the elimination of this practice, not regulating the practice itself.
Do you mind expanding on that? What do you mean by discomfort?
What I mean by discomfort is, while we would articulate legal positions that have been researched, generated from our own expertise and experience on these questions, there would still be questions that we would go through that are outlined in the consultation, which already presume the continuation of street checks and carding. And so our position was, well, we can't even have a conversation about these questions because they already legitimate the process. So if we start giving you answers to them in the way in which they're articulated to us, it suggests that you're already leaning towards having this practice. And that actually is already evidenced in the consultation document that was released to the community, where the practice of street checks and carding is noted as an investigative tool, is seen as necessary for public safety, and ultimately giving the impression that the government wants to see it in place. But as has been noted by our organization and countless other organizations, not just representatives of the Black community, there is absolutely no data to substantiate that carding is effective in solving crime. But we would also go further at the African Canadian Legal Clinic and say, even if you find instances where, and we've heard 1 in a million cases that have been noted, Cecilia Zhang, and also Colonel, Colonel Saunders? Russell Williams. Colonel Russell Williams. These are being cited as examples of where carding and street checks are effective. But that's absolutely ridiculous, because what we're talking about are non-criminal interactions. For those interactions with Cecilia Zhang and Russell Williams, you already had cases being investigated. But what we're talking about when we talk about street checks and carding is individuals just going about their day, not having criminal encounters.
Is the feeling here that the province has already made up their mind and these consultations are just looking for validation?
I would say that that's a large part of that, the feeling of why we've come together and decided to assert our voices in this way.
Do you think some of those people who have lived experience will be invited to be part of this consultation, or people who have experience being arrested and hardened and detained, or that? Are they going to be there? Is that kind of thing you think?
Well, we at the African Canadian Legal Clinic have encouraged community members who have that lived experience to be part of the consultation process, so the decision makers have an intimate understanding of what's at stake here. But we always leave it to community to make its own decision and recognize the agency within our community and diversity of perspectives and approaches to this issue. But again, ultimately what we found from the folks who decide to go and voice their opinion, or the individuals who decide that it's not worth subjecting themselves to that, is that they still want to see the practice end. Any other questions?
This morning there's this press conference, and what else is planned for today?
So we had this press conference this morning to articulate our position. Later in the evening at 5 o'clock, there was also a silent protest that will be happening at Yonge and Bloor. That's 5 o'clock, and that's just before the province's final consultation, as far as we know, for Toronto, which is going to be happening at the Toronto Public Library at 6 o'clock. And so we encourage folks who do feel that it's important to participate to do so, or find other ways to articulate their message on why carding needs to be abolished and eliminated. Thank you.
Anthony, I have a question. Why do you think the consultation process, why was Toronto ignored when the biggest issue of carding happens in Toronto?
I couldn't tell you why they decided to keep Toronto off the initial list, but I think it speaks to the fundamental disrespect of the Black community. While certainly there are communities in Ottawa, there are communities in Windsor, London, Waterloo, Hamilton who experience this, and we don't diminish that experience, this Toronto is is the bedrock of where this conversation started. It's where the largest African Canadian community, not just in Ontario, but in Canada is. And so we take it as part of the general anti-Black racism that exists within government, within cultures, and the ways in which they decide to operate. It would be absolutely unfathomable to have a consultation on the rights of Indigenous people in the heart of, or in every community but where you find the largest Indigenous populations. It would be absolutely ridiculous. And the same thing could be said of other communities. And so again, we have to ask ourselves, who is actually at the table to decide what goes into the regulations and what doesn't? Who are those advisors? Do they have the lived and intimate experience of being carded in street check, or their family members being carded in street check? And if they do, why didn't that affect the decision as to where these consultations will happen?
Well, let's look at the upcoming election. Has carding been an issue? Has the leaders been asked such questions? I know there was a women's debate that was cancelled, but should there be a debate on civil rights or the Black issues and so on?
Absolutely. It's without question, these issues should be put on the table for the national election. We have the Black Votes Matter Canada campaign that is being led by the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists and other organizations like the ACLC, and we encourage other folks to participate in that. And why it's important to put it on the national agenda is because we have to look at the fact that carding, in terms of its modern manifestation, has accelerated. At the same time, the incarceration rate of African Canadians has exploded by between 70 and 90% since 2003. And so we have to look at whether or not there is a connection there. I think it behooves us all to say, okay, look at the fact that we have this overrepresentation in these interactions, and look at the accelerated population. What is happening there, right? And so when we're looking at reforming our criminal justice system, we have to say that this needs to be on the agenda, and not only for the overrepresentation, but also the disproportionate punishing of African Canadians within prisons. And so the Office of the Correctional Investigator, Howard Sapers, just 2 months ago released a report showing that the use of segregation on African Canadians has increased by 100% in the last 10 years. 100% in 10 years. This practice has been used specifically against African Canadians, while it's gone down for other communities, whites and Indigenous communities even. This is a significant problem, and we need to address it on the national stage.
And I have a question for the lady on your right. I know there was an effort to speak to John Tory, the mayor. Has it been successful? Have you spoken to the mayor or the chief of police since he was chosen earlier this year?
So we did reach out to the mayor to ask for a meeting with the community to talk about interlocal and also the carding itself. We told him we wanted one that was accessible and also transparent to the Black community here in Toronto, and so far he's been reluctant to meet with us. So we have put our cards on the table. We're only waiting for his response because we want accountability and transparency for everyone involved in carding and also in the Black community.
How about the chief of police?
He has said nothing.
Patrick.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. The ministry has issued an updated document. It's on a note from the minister that tries to contextualize the whole consultation process, what they anticipate will come out of it, and basically right space and all of that. Do you think that will change your approach and your response to the consultation?
Can't speak to the document because I haven't seen it, so it would be difficult to comment. But of course, the question again remains: we haven't had an influx of Black people to the city of or the province of Ontario in the last couple of days. We've always been here. We've always been calling for the same. So the question is, why wasn't that framing part of the initial consultation? And again, I think it speaks to the general lack of recognition of how significantly this practice impacts on the Black community and the wider community in terms of our collective well-being and civic citizenship.
When we talk about systemic, that's a big web. How systemically cooperative have been the press over the many years of our experiences of these systems? Maybe from anyone of you can comment on that, because they are here too.
Well, I guess Rinaldo. We will have to be honest and say that in terms of the mainstream press, the Toronto Star has led
They've done really excellent investigative work and really excellent analysis of the stats that they've been able to get a hold of. So we have to give them kudos for that. I think part of the larger problem, though, in relationship to your question is, what kinds of questions do the press ask of the premier? How do the press do the kind of comparative work that's necessary to push Kathleen Wynne to be accountable to all of the citizens of this province? And the carding issue, in comparison with the sexual and gender violence issue, really bears it out in very significant ways, right? And it's not to say that Black people are not also impacted by sexual and gendered violence, but to see the way in which she's led and the kudos that she's been given at the same time that she has been morally and politically bankrupt on carding, and that she's not been pushed on these questions, for me, raises a number of significant questions about the work that mainstream media is doing in challenging her around the ways in which she's produced as some kind of thoughtful premier. And similarly with Mayor Tory, right? That somehow he's gathering the information that he's thoughtful. Well, no, these are really silent, bankrupt positions that under any other circumstances, and I go back to the example I gave that to the Black gay man, we will not in 2015 have consultations around whether or not LGBT people can have access to their full rights due to the charter. Like, we would not have that. The media would be constantly asking questions at every presser that the premier had on why they were having such consultations. Comes to Black people, as they say online, crickets.
So you've had this discussion around, we're talking about consultation quite a bit. I just had a question about, that is one, of course, aspect of getting people's voice, hearing people's voices and hearing their concerns. And another one, someone talked about maybe Chris around the Black Votes Matter and how the response has been going in that respect, and has that made a difference? Because I know that it'll, as Anthony said, that predominantly Blacks are in Toronto specifically, and how will those votes impact the upcoming election?
Just following up on Anthony's point, CBTU has been holding Black Votes Matters sessions across Canada and Toronto, Ottawa, Halifax to engage the community in this broader issue of mass incarceration of peoples of African descent and make it an issue in this federal election. But this point that we're making in the context of this election is also relevant provincially, because at the end of the day, if the Kathleen Wynne government decides to introduce regulation and not abolish carding, our position is not going to change. We're going to continue to stand with community allies and fight to end the carding practice. And if that ultimately, when the day comes, means holding Kathleen Wynne politically accountable, we'll be running those same sessions here provincially, talking about engaging our community in provincial politics as well.
Having said that, a question that is constantly raised within the community, but seemingly not by media, is the issue of Premier Wynne standing and supporting a federal candidate who we know here in Toronto was very supportive and adamant about maintaining or elongating carding. And the curious question here is, what is the community's position publicly to the media, because it's not being said in the media, about that conflict of interest?
Go ahead and say something.
Well, that's certainly an important question, and the community recognizes, we're speaking specifically about Chief Bill Blair, who fundamentally backpedaled on some of the very important human rights protections that were in the flawed but still positive 2014 street checks or carding policy for the city of Toronto, and the community will certainly respond to that. That's part of the Black Votes Matter Canada campaign, to make sure that there's accountability and these connections are being drawn and that they impact our votes moving forward.
I think there's a couple of cascading issues here, and one has to do with the recent passage of Bill C-51, that we must be very clear will significantly also target African Muslims, Black Muslims, as well in this place. So there's some cascading issues. So when you look at a candidate like Bill Blair, should he end up in Ottawa, he's probably going to have some influence on the justice agenda there. And so we have to be very clear that from carding to C-51, Black lives are imperiled by all kinds of legislation. that seek to make us constantly out of place, that seeks to continue to